Logic games was my worst section back when I first started studying for the LSAT, and they were a major reason why I was stuck in the low 150s for far too long. I would have gotten my 175 much more easily if they hadn't been on the test. So for me, removing logic games would have increased my LSAT score, and I imagine the same is true for many other humanities majors like myself. For me personally, I majored in political science. I know many of you out there did as well. Now, I was a splitter applicant, not by choice, of course, but because I had a low GPA, I had to make up for it with a high LSAT score, and that motivation fueled me to put in the work necessary for me to get a 175 on LSAT test day. The good news is that if you're a splitter, you can make up for a low GPA by getting a higher LSAT score. Let's take a look at placing the LSAT in the context of the law school admissions process as a whole. The three biggest factors in admissions are your LSAT score, your GPA, and your application essays. Now, most law schools publish their law school admission indices, meaning their calculations or their formulas of how they weigh LSAT relative to GPA. And the good news is they weigh LSAT scores a lot more heavily. So, meaning if you've got a relatively lower GPA, you can make up for it with getting a higher LSAT score since LSAT is weighed more heavily. Now, if we look at the T14 law schools, all of them have GPA medians of 3.8 to 3.9. So if your GPA is below a 3.8, you're going to want to make up for it with a relatively higher LSAT score. Now, the T14 LSAT medians are all 170 to 175. So if you're below a 3.8, you want to be at least 173, 174 to have a decent shot at getting in to those T14 law schools. Whether you like it or not, unfortunately, law school application essays matter a whole lot less. GPAs are subject to, of course, rampant grade inflation, but your LSAT score is a relatively more objective factor, not subject to the same grade inflation from professors who don't believe in grades and just give everybody A's, like one professor I had in college. Now, of course, there is LSAT score inflation for a couple of reasons. One is the previous LSAT flex format made it a lot easier for students to get high LSAT scores because LSAC underestimated how much easier the temporary flex format would be. There's also a lot of LSAT score inflation due to LSAC becoming a lot more liberal in granting accommodations like extra time in recent years. And because the LSAT is now offered more frequently than it used to be a couple of years back, now it's 8 times a year as opposed to 4 times a year, it's easier to retake the LSAT because there are more opportunities to do so, and law schools only count the highest score that you have on record. Now, a lot of folks are saying the LSAT's going to get easier without logic games. Others are saying it's going to get harder without logic games. Now, I mentioned for a lot of humanities majors like myself, the LSAT is easier without logic games. For STEM majors, the LSAT may be harder without logic games because STEM majors tended to do better on the logic game section. Same goes for non-native English speakers, by the way. But the thing is, of course, there are a lot more humanities majors than there are STEM majors, and there are a lot more native English speakers taking the LSAT than there are non-native English speakers taking the LSAT. But of course, we should draw a distinction here because an easier LSAT doesn't necessarily make it easier to get a top score because LSAC will just adjust the curve accordingly. And we already see some indications they're doing that. LSAT scores came back a lot lower for many April and June test takers than folks were expecting. And this could be because LSAC is looking to reduce LSAT score inflation due to the factors I mentioned, the LSAT flex format, the extra time accommodations, and the fact that it's now easier to retake the LSAT. Now, although the logic game section is hard for many students at first, it's actually the easiest section to learn and perfect. So the logic game section no longer being on the test may mean that it's now harder to get a perfect or a top LSAT score in terms of raw score because it's harder to get a score perfectly on logical reasoning or reading comp than it was on the logic game section. But of course, again, this does not necessarily make it easier to get a top score because LSAC will just, again, adjust the curve accordingly. In LSAC's own analysis of the data, looking at the curves on the LSAT with and without the logic game section, they found that the curves ultimately came out essentially the same. Of course, some individual students do better than others, but the curve ended up being nearly identical in aggregate, looking at how populations of test takers performed as a whole. Now, all this to say, long story short, it's not clear whether LSAC's removing logic games will make it easier to get a top LSAT score or whether it will affect LSAT medians in one direction or another, but we can safely say that with the LSAT being offered more frequently and with LSAC being more liberal and granting accommodations, LSAT medians will likely keep rising regardless. By LSAC's own admission, they are now granting extra time accommodations to 98% of those who ask for them, and this isn't likely to change anytime soon. Now, one factor you can impact, of course, is that you can narrow your focus on the LSAT prep to logical reasoning specifically, because with the removal of the logic game section and that section being replaced with a second scored logical reasoning section, it's now 2/3 of the test. So you can narrow your focus and focus at least 2/3 of your time on the logical reasoning section. And any gains you make in your understanding of logical reasoning will be doubled across the two sections. Now, there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, but not all of them show up in equal proportion, meaning some are more common than others. The most common types are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. So make sure that you master those 3 types. But of course, you don't just want to stop there. You also want to focus on the method of reasoning in the stimulus, making sure that you actually understand the argument. And you also want to focus on your review process so that you can learn from your mistakes and avoid making them again in the future. Now, I've developed a framework for helping you review better called the Socratic Review Method. It's a cornerstone of my LSAT courses and my one-on-one LSAT coaching programs. If you're interested in finding out more, check out the link below the video to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And of course, you can do logic games all you want. I'm certainly sad to see logic games go as well, but it is what it is. And the good news is that law schools won't care which version of the test you took, with the games or without. It's all the same to them, and they don't mind if you retake the LSAT because, again, they only take the highest score on records. And so for this reason alone, I actually recommend that everyone retake the LSAT if possible, because through luck alone, you could do a few points better. If so, great. And if you don't, no big deal at all. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.